Welcome to this week's lecture on the politics and development of Vietnam since the 1980s. Over the previous week of your field trip to our country, you probably have heard many times of the story of đổi mới or renovation. Vietnam was devastated by decades of wars, by the colonial legacy, and by a stagnant planned economy coming on to the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s. But we were able to rejuvenate ourselves, to reform the economy along a more market-oriented model, and of course, usher in the upcoming decades of rapid growth, development, and prosperity. Đổi mới has been often discussed as a strictly economic phenomenon, but as we all know, like many reforms all throughout the world, it affected every single aspect of Vietnamese society, both socially and of course politically as well. In these pictures, to open our lecture today, it described the first meetings of the 8th Assembly of the National Assembly of Vietnam. Even though the 7th Assembly had already implemented some moderate reforms and initiated đổi mới itself, it was the 8th Assembly that kickstarted the reforms into overdrive, with the ultimate being the 1992 Constitution, forming the legislative customs and form many new apparatus to eventually operate the market economies along the line of a socialist market-oriented one. Before we move on to talk about some issues facing the political system in Vietnam, let me reintroduce you briefly to our political system. The political structure in Vietnam is very much inspired by that of the former Soviet Union. Over the years, we were able to adapt it to the Vietnamese context to serve the Vietnamese purposes. There always exists a parallel between the Communist Party of Vietnam and our state apparatus. According to the 1992 Constitution, once again, it reiterates the political legitimacy of the Communist Party as the only legitimate political leadership in Vietnam. As the party is the vanguard of Vietnamese working class, loyal representative of the rights of the working class, the working people, and the whole nation. The Communist Party is led by a central committee, the members being elected by millions of party members throughout the country. And of course, the central committees had a Politburo at the very top. The party is supposed to produce political, socio-economic directive of which the state apparatus would try to produce policies and legislation to manifest these directives into reality. At every single governmental level, from the state to the local level, there's always exists an equivalent party apparatus to oversight these offices, these governmental offices. Moving on to the governments of Vietnam, we the state apparatus of Vietnam has a basic structure of separation of power, the legislative branch being the National Assembly, the executive branch being the state presidency, the head of state, and of course the government and the many ministries, and the judiciary branch being the People's Supreme Court. According to the Vietnamese Constitution, the National Assembly holds the utmost legislative power in our country. It represents the people's will, and of course, the Assembly is directly elected by the members of the eligible publics every 5 years. The Assembly is responsible to legislate and to also elect the state presidencies, the prime ministers, and the ministries on the behalf of the Vietnamese nations. Of course, the Assembly is also responsible for choosing the judges of the People's Supreme Court as well. The political system of Vietnam functions on the ideological principle of democratic centralism, belonging to Leninist thinking. Basically, free in discourses and united in action. Within the Vietnamese context, we interpreted it as that in Vietnam, we respect people's individualities, but an individual must be willing to serve the common good and the interests of the collective. The story of political reforms in the Đổi Mới era would also be the story of how we try to implement the principle of democratic centralism in an ever-changing world. More than anywhere else, the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government understand the value of a coherent political society, given the fact that the country experienced upheavals due to wars and conflict for many decades. Thus, it is paramount for the Communist Party of Vietnam and the state to maintain relative political stabilities while facilitate the rapid development that we have observed since the 1980s. Thus, political reforms within the Đổi Mới era means to improve transparency of the political process while keeping the system intact. One of the most significant changes were that it is now more welcoming, more tolerable towards criticisms and scrutinies pointed towards leadership positions. At a macro level, it is now common practice for policies and legislation made by the National Assembly to be debated within its meetings. It is common practice for people to comment their opinions on such policies in the public sphere. At a macro level, students or employees are now more willing to criticize and scrutinize the actions of their administrators, be it the school or their employers. A lot of past historical events that was deemed previously taboo are now opened for the public to discuss and comment on. The media are now able to scrutinize policies at both state and local level for the public to see. And of course, more provocative, artistic, and literary expression are now being allowed in Vietnam as well. Also, prior to Đổi Mới, only a few individuals held official posts for a very long period of time. That has changed with the Đổi Mới eras to meet with the ever-changing expectation of the Vietnamese people and of the outside world. Even though we don't have a fixed limit on terms, it is common political norms in Vietnam for a person to only serve a maximum of 2 terms of 5 years. Also, within the Đổi Mới eras, efforts had been constantly made to simplify and streamline the bureaucracy of the Vietnamese administration from top to local level. The idea was that if we reduce the red tape involved in the administrative process, it would allow the free market and the public to function much more efficiently. Within the National Assembly itself, a vote of confidence has been introduced so that the assembly, the representatives of the people, would be able to judge the performance of many ministries in the years in the years of responsibilities that they were entrusted with. And of course, in modern Vietnam, National Assembly meetings are publicly televised on public televisions for every single members of the population to see, so that they are informed of what is going on, what is being debated within the legislative structure, and also to potentially join in the discourse. There has also been increasingly direct lines for the public to contact their representative within the National Assembly as well. And of course, the 1992 Constitution, after 2 decades, was eventually renovated and reformed into the 2013 Constitution, in which the leadership role, the legitimacy of the Communist Party of Vietnam was again reiterated, but it affirms that the Communist Party of Vietnam exists to serve the Vietnamese people, to serve the interests of the Vietnamese nation, and its legitimacy is only invested in by the Vietnamese people. Of course, the 2013 Constitution affirmed the structure of separation of power within the state apparatus by explicitly define the roles of each branches of our government, be it the National Assembly, the government and its many ministry, and the People's Supreme Court. And to meet the technological advancement and the rise of the internet over the past few decades, In 2018, a set of cybersecurity law was introduced by the National Assembly. Before, in Vietnam, internet space was at the mercy of big techs and their terms of conditions. Now, the cybersecurity law was designed to regulate and govern people's behavior in a Vietnamese national context, taking powers away from foreign big tech and foreign social networking companies. Ever since 2011, the Communist Party of Vietnam was led by General Secretary Nguyễn Phú Trọng. The 2010s were generally perceived as a successful period for Vietnam, as we were able to achieve constantly high economic growth and also a lot of positive social developments, tail end by an initial successful attempt at controlling the COVID-19 pandemic. In the 2010s, Mr. Chok spearheaded an effort to create a more coherent and united party structure, and also extends to the state apparatus as well. The parties of the 2000s were usually perceived as being plagued by a lot of individualism, of splintering itself into many interest groups, and of course, many despotism at high-ranking positions. Thus, Mr. Chok set out many clear ideological, political, and social standards for party members in the 2010s, especially if you want to reach certain position within a parties. There was so that a high-ranking party member would have to declare their economic status as well. Also, under Mr. Chok's leadership, the parties and the state underwent a far-reaching, massive anti-corruption campaigns when a lot of high-ranking former officials was being tried for their corrupted actions and frauds against the Vietnamese people. In recent years, we have the clear example of the trials of Mr. Đinh La Thăng, the former Ho Chi Minh City party chief in 2018, and of course recently in 2021, the former president of the Hanoi People's Council, Mr. Nguyễn Đức Chung, was also put to trial as well for his corrupted action in office. If you follow Vietnamese news in recent time, there was also massive scandals being investigated for a lot of state-owned enterprise exploiting the pandemic to fix the price of medical supplies. All of this actions was being brought into daylight by the action of the Communist Party under Mr. Chok's leadership over the past decades. Of course, there are still many challenges facing the political system of Vietnam in the foreseeable future. Reforms must be done constantly and continuously to ensure a coherence between the governance and the societies it tries to govern. Thus, reforms are regularly proposed and debated within the National Assembly and the Communist Party itself.
there has always been outcry for further streamlining and simplification of the administrative process and of the state bureaucracy, especially at the local level, where many people deem the current large local council system remains ineffective and redundant. Also, there is a question of the relationship between the state and the many state-owned industries and enterprises. In the last decades, many cases of state-owned enterprise abusing their powers to commit fraud has been brought to daylight by the actions of the Communist Party and the governments of Vietnam. There are also the issues of inefficiency as well. As Vietnam trying to integrate itself into the global economies, there are questions of our status as a market economy coming from our trade partners, primarily coming from these large subsidies pointing towards the state-owned corporations and state-owned industry. This is a very difficult and delicate balancing act for the Communist Party and the government to contemplate. As we have witnessed in the United Kingdom, for example, a rapid process of privatization along the neoliberalist line will cause unrepairable social divisions for years to come. That would be an undesirable result that the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese political system would want to avoid. Thus, of course, a very, very difficult question for the consideration of the Vietnamese state in the years to come. And as with many rapidly developing economies, there is a ever widening wealth and economic gaps between the urban middle class and the countryside population in Vietnam. Many of the people living in countryside and agriculturally dominated area are still living under the poverty line, which go against the principle, our principle of socio-economic equalities, that everyone would be taken care of in the time of needs. And of course, in a globalized world, with economic prosperity becoming the norm, with people becoming increasingly socially secure, the roles of the Vietnamese citizens are being changed days by days by the Vietnamese integration into the larger world. We as a people are now becoming more aware of issues both nationally and globally, such as climate change, gender equalities, economic equalities, and so on. Thus, how the Communist Party engage with its citizens moving forward, how the political system balance the commitment to stabilities and the ever diverse changing opinions of the public would be an interesting question for us to see, to observe, and to answer in the future. Thank you very much for listening to me. We will meet again in the coming weeks for further discussion. Again, thank you.